how many of you remember what this is? Beanie Babies. Yes. Beanie Babies. So anyone that grew up in the United States and is in their late 20s or has children in their late 20s might recall that this was a craze that was sweeping the country. I'm not sure about the world. Have you ever heard about these TY Beanie Babies? They were, originally they're just little stuffed Beanie Baby sort of things. And every so often they'd come out with a batch of new varieties, new animals, new colors, sometimes realistic looking, sometimes more fantastically colored. But they were always like highly anticipated moments. Kids of this time, and 8, 9, 10 years old, really were getting excited about these and were amassing collections of them. What was kind of helping feed the excitement was some clever marketing by the company that produced these, where they would limit the amount of certain varieties that were made. One that comes to mind was they always have cute names. So the elephant was called Peanut, because elephants like to pick up peanuts with their trunk. And it was light blue. The one you really wanted was dark blue peanut, because they were a mistake. The factory somehow made a mistake, and they stopped the production quickly. So there weren't that many of them, but those were the ones that you really wanted. So there was always the mythical dark blue peanut. So there were some other classic ones like this, and the rarity added to the appeal, to the point where there was a big market for swapping and selling. And this was also during the rise of eBay, which was the perfect platform for buying and trading and people looking to make a quick buck. In the case of one example, there was a family, a couple, that invested, with air quotes, $100,000 in Beanie Babies with the expectation that they were going to be able to cash in and pay for their college educations for their 5 children. And 20 years later, they are probably still wondering what they're going to do with this garage full of Beanie Babies. Fortunately, we in our house only have 2 trash bag sized bins of these things in our attic. We never spent, as far as I know, more than face value, which they were like $5 or something like that. Now, it's easy to kind of look back and laugh at that, but it's not the only time this has happened. You may have heard about the Dutch tulip craze. How many people have ever heard about this? The tulip bulb craze in the early 1600s. It's a little bit of a background. Tulips originated in Central Asia. The Ottoman Empire picked them up and brought them a little bit more westwards from their outer reaches of their frontier over to areas such as Turkey and so on. And the Dutch, being very active explorers and traders, spent a lot of time on the ocean, saw these, brought the bulbs back to the Netherlands. The interesting thing about tulips to the European eye was, picture a tulip now. What are you picturing? Deep red, deep yellow, deep, intense colors were very unusual for flowers at the time. And they were attractive. People liked tulips. The other thing about the Netherlands is, I mentioned they were very established explorers, active in trading. Also, their wealth had allowed a booming art scene, as we would call it now. Think about the old Dutch masters, guys like Rembrandt and Vermeers and so on. The Netherlands was a real arts place. Also science. I think it was Leeuwenhoek who invented the microscope. The Netherlands, the Dutch were big in optics. A lot of inventions. And where science and art kind of meet was actually they had a good ceramics industry. So art, beauty, science, wealth, all transpired to create an environment of a wealthy aristocratic class that appreciated beauty and had money and liked these flowers. So they would start to collect them. The flowers were, they would buy bulbs and sell them, and eventually they became like a society. There would be clubs that would meet in taverns. And just over some drinks with their friends, just swap and buy and barter and trade. And eventually these markets got really sophisticated. They created what we would call now a futures market, buying on the value of future bulbs, because you plant them in the fall, they don't bloom until the spring. That's the way most bulbs work. And especially valued were these striped, these striated varieties. This is an example of one of them. They had all kinds of exotic names they would give to them, very ornate and fancy names. And these multi-pattern, multi-textured, multi-striated colors were the really sought-after ones. They were the dark blue peanut of the era. They were rare because they couldn't be bred. The striations were formed by a virus. They were caused by a virus called the mosaic virus. So it's kind of an unpredictable thing that added to the scarcity. So there was a rising value of these to the point where, actually it did form a bubble. So people got caught up in a little bit of this speculation and buying and selling to paying some actually rather high prices for these things, like the equivalent of a annual salary of a skilled laborer, for example. There were some cases where that was known to have occurred. Now, to a rich person, I mean, that would be, we'll think about it in other luxury good items, like buying a Ferrari or whatever. Who needs that? Or a Coach bag. I don't know how much those cost. I don't know what the appeal is, but similar things like that. I mean, there are things of beauty people like. They have the money to afford them, but the prices did spike, and there was a sense of a social camaraderie and a competition. But what happened is, as the story goes, people started seeing the rising prices. And it wasn't just the people originally that were in on the deal that wanted it, like the kids of the Beanie Baby era, but now it was the lesser classes. There were stories in this book written by, this is in 1841, written by Charles Mackay, borrowing a lot from other earlier books from the 1700s, mentioning things like that the population, even to its lowest dregs, embarked in the tulip trade. Talks about weavers and chimney sweeps and farmers spending their investments on these things, including stories like one sale where 40 bulbs were sold for the equivalent, for 100,000 florins, the equivalent of 400 years of wages for a skilled laborer. One especially interesting story about a sailor that was hungry and he inadvertently or unknowingly boiled a tulip bulb and ate it and was thrown into jail because he ate the equivalent of the wages that could have paid the entire crew's salary for a whole year. Once the bubble collapsed, as these things inevitably do, because there's not really any intrinsic value in that, in tulip bulbs, popular culture jumped aboard with paintings and sketches and songs pointing out how foolish people were. Here's one of a god of flowers or beauty leading this merry band of, now a pathetic band of investors that were duped into spending all their life's worth of savings down to the sea to their demise, and stories about people casting themselves into canals and killing themselves, and the government stepping in to stave off economic catastrophe. Makes good stories. There's a bit of stuff in there that's apocryphal, a lot of it. There were some stories about actually only 37 known cases of people spending up to 1 year's of salary. Still a lot, not 400 years. There were never any stories of any documented tales of people committing suicide The Dutch economy did not collapse, but yet it's a sign that there is kind of a bubble effect that's often used as a cautionary tale. But I will submit that there's really another cautionary tale. And that is, with what you've seen here, when someone starts to talk about the Dutch tulip craze, that when you realize that there's really more truth to that, the cautionary tale is to not appear too smug and don't look like a know-it-all when you say, actually, Toastmasters.
Thank you.